Hello and welcome to the CoC Admin Project and Grant Setup Training video. This video is just designed for CoC admins, and so the menu options and forms we'll be looking at are not available to a standard end user. As a CoC admin, one of your responsibilities is to help set up projects and grants, and in this training video I'll be showing you how to do that. We'll start by looking at how to set up a project, then we'll look at how to set up a grant to go along with that project. And then third, I'll show you how to link the two together, a required step for projects to work correctly in the system. So now we'll go ahead and navigate over to the project search screen. To find that, you'll want to go under your Georgia CoC admin menu, hover over Setup Data Management, and then click on Projects. This will show all your pre-existing projects that are in the system. Up here allows us to search for those projects. So for instance, if I typed in Athens, I would now see any project that has Athens somewhere in the title. If I wanted to search by project type, I could do this, and now we're just looking at emergency shelters. The next options here by default are checked. This one, show only HMIS projects, is only going to list projects that have a program or what would be called a project type associated with it. Now anytime you create a project in the system, you should choose a project type, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But if you just created a project and you're wondering why you can't even search for it on the screen, it might be because you forgot to include that project type. And so you could always uncheck that box and it would allow you to then see that. And then we have show only active projects. This is only going to show projects that do not have an end date that has already passed. So if you have a project that you've set an end date for and that end date has already passed, it would not show up on the search screen if this is ticked, but you can always untick it if you need to search for older discontinued projects. Over here we have the Add HMIS Project button. That's what we would click to create a brand new project. Here it lets us page through the different projects, so it's only going to show a maximum of 200 at a time. Here's our action button, which we'll get into what all these buttons do a little bit later. In this column here, we just have the project title, which you will note by default it is categorizing these by program type. So we can see all of our coordinated assessment or coordinated entry projects are here. Next we have our emergency shelter projects and so forth. Here we have our organization column. So every project is going to have one primary, or what we would call an owning organization, and that's going to be listed here. Here we have the program ID. So every project that's created in the system is automatically assigned a unique program ID, and that'll be listed here. For any projects that were migrated from your previous HMIS implementation, they will have a source ID. And here we have our CoC code. So it is possible for a project to be set up to cover multiple CoCs, and when a project is set up in that way, on this search screen here, the project is now going to be listed multiple times. So we see that's happening right here with this coordinated entry test. We see there's 3 listings for it. However, if we look at the program ID, it's the same ID, so we know this is in fact really just one project that was set up in the system. But we can look at the CoC column here and we can see it's covering 3 different CoCs. And so that's just a little caveat on this search screen when dealing with projects that cover multiple CoCs. Also, if you need to ever go in and make a modification on a project like this, you will need to always interact with the first one that's listed. If I went down and tried to edit this one, for instance, I would get an error message as well on that one, but if I choose the first one in the list, it'll let me go ahead and pull it up and make any changes that I need to. Next we have program type, auto exit days. We'll get into later what that is talking about, but if you have any projects set up with that, it'll list the number of days here. And then you'll have your program start date, and if there's an end date selected, it'll be listed. Also, all of these columns can be sorted, so if you click the little arrow here, it will allow you to do the different sorting. So now for this training, we are going to say that we need to create a new project in the system. And the first thing we're going to want to do is go make sure we are logged in as the organization that we want this project to be under. So I'm going to say that I want this project to be under my training organization, so I'm logged in as them. And now I'm going to click on Add HMIS Project. This will take us to the project setup screen, which is going to allow us to create a new project. So the first step here is to create a project name. So we do want to be particular with the way we name a project. I would not want to go in and use a very generic name such as emergency shelter. That's not really going to be beneficial to keep all of the hundreds of projects we have in the system organized. It's not going to be beneficial for the end user because they might have several emergency shelter projects that they offer at their agency. So the standard practice we have been using is actually starting with the agency name in the project label. So I know that this one is under my training organization. Then we would go ahead and add the particular project name. We're going to say this is called John's Shelter. And then finally we would include the project type, and we can just acronym that. We're going to say this is an emergency shelter, and this covers CoC 500. Now we have a project name that is beneficial. It's beneficial to admins because, for instance, if we were on the previous search screen we were just on, we could search for my training organization and automatically get any projects that are created under that organization. This is going to be beneficial to the end user, like I mentioned. They might have multiple shelter projects. They can distinguish it here. They can know what project type, and then they might have multiple emergency shelter projects, but that each one covers a different CoC, and so having this number here is going to be beneficial for that. I will say we get a good bit of tickets from time to time from end users that have accidentally enrolled a client into the wrong project, and it's usually where there's cases where there's a lot of different projects their agency offers and the naming is very similar and they get mixed up. So just something to think about when naming projects. Next we have clients can enroll. This would normally always be selected as yes. If you select this as no, it will not allow any end users to see this project as an option to enroll a client into. So when they're doing an intake and they get to that program enrollment screen, they will not see this project as an option. Also, if you're familiar with the current enrollments screen, which is a screen the end users have access to, which allows them to get a drop down of all of their projects, and then they can click on one of those projects and see all of the currently enrolled clients they have. Well, if you choose no on this and they go to current enrollment screen, they will not see this program listed here either. Couple reasons why you might want to use this option would be, say you're setting up a project for the future. Maybe an agency has already got you the information, but they don't want it to go live yet. Well, you could go ahead and set everything up, but just choose no on this, and then that way the end users will not see this as an option, and then you can later go in and mark it as yes. Or another reason might be a project is going away, maybe it's being discontinued and you do not want end users to see it as an option. You can go in and mark it as no as well. Also, throughout Client Track, you'll see these little help bubbles. You can always hover your mouse over that, and these will give you some helpful information on the different fields. Here we have operating start date. This is going to be required. And you do want to make sure you choose the appropriate date here. So this is going to be the earliest date that a client could start in this project. So for instance, I could just assume that this is a brand new project that this agency has, and I could use today's date. However, maybe this is a project they've been using for a long time. They already have clients in it. They're just now starting to use HMIS though, but they're going to want to backdate clients. If that's the case, then I might need to change this date to a few weeks back, a few months back, maybe even a few years back. And so we're just going to want to make sure we use the appropriate date here for the operating start date. Operating end date is not required, as you can tell by a lack of an asterisk. If you choose an end date, it's just going to mean they could not enroll a client with a start date that is past whatever date you choose here. This is also what you could do if a project is no longer being used. You can set an end date, and that would just not allow people to continue to enroll clients after that. Define eligibility is a feature we're not currently using in the system, and part of the setup behind it would need to be done by a system admin, so you would not have the permission in the system to do that. It wouldn't allow you to do that. So that's something you can disregard. This is what I talked about earlier, the owning or primary organization for the project. So you will need to select this. We're going to say that this one is under the My Training organization. So again, a project will always have only one of these owning org or primary organizations. We will see later on you can assign multiple organizations to a project, but this one will come into play if you're familiar with the APR. Question 4 of the APR lists the organization, and that's where this is going to come from as well. And for most projects, they're just going to be working under one organization anyway, so normally it's pretty straightforward setting it up. Next we have the project type. This is something you always want to include, and this is maybe one of the most important fields under project setup. You really want to make sure you are choosing the correct project type. Now we have noticed sometimes an agency, they might think that a particular project needs to be under a project type when it really needs to be under a different project type. And so as a CoC admin, part of your kind of duties will be working with agencies, making sure you kind of have an understanding of these projects and they are being set up correctly. A few tools at your disposal are the HUD Data Dictionary and also the HUD Program Manuals. Those can be very beneficial in helping determine the appropriate project type. Depending on the project type you choose, you might also have some additional questions that will pop up on this form. So for instance, if I choose emergency shelter, now I'm asked the method for tracking emergency shelter utilization. Currently, we're using entry-exit with all of our emergency shelters. This is kind of the less complicated way to do record enrollments in system, and this is how all other project types record clients being enrolled into the system. And this is just based on when a client comes into my emergency shelter, I would enroll them, and then when they leave, I would exit them. The other option here is night by night. This is a little bit more complex and complicated method where they would need to enroll the client when they first come to the project, when they first come into their shelter, but then they would have to record a bed night service for every night that client is there. So there's a little bit more setup, a little more complexity to that, but as I mentioned, right now we're using entry and exit for all of those emergency shelters. If you choose services only, you'll be asked, is this affiliated with a residential project? If you need any more verbiage on this, you can look to your HUD documentation. If I choose yes on this, it's going to then show me the different residential projects here, and I would need to go ahead and select one. For several of these different project types, if I choose them, it's going to have the HOPWA type as an option here. So for instance, if I choose transitional housing, it'll be listed. If I choose street outreach, it won't be, because there's no such thing as a street outreach HOPWA project. But if I am setting up a HOPWA project, I do need to be sure to fill out this HOPWA type. And then another thing to note here is that while this says transitional housing for project type, it's going to list all the potential HOPWA types here. And so I'm going to need to know as a CoC admin what is the appropriate HOPWA type that would go along with transitional housing. And also, if I don't choose a HOPWA type, and this is a HOPWA project, it will not populate the numbers on HOPWA APR. So if you're running HOPWA APRs, or end users are running HOPWA APRs and they're wondering why they're not getting any of their data showing on it, it could be because the HOPWA type is missing. And that's definitely a common thing we've seen in some of the projects that have been set up. So just something to take note of. For this project, though, we're saying this is an emergency shelter, and of course we will leave it at the entry and exit model. And we're saying this is not a HOPWA emergency shelter, so we'll leave that blank. Here we have housing type. If you need any documentation on that, this is in the data dictionary under data elements 2.7 and 2.8. Here we have our target population. This is going to be relevant for the HIC, so we do want to make sure we are selecting what's appropriate here. Victim services provider should never be marked yes, because in our implementation we would not have victim services providers keying into HMIS, so this can either be left blank or no. And we do get a lot of questions on continuum project, as there's some confusion around that. So a common misunderstanding here is that this just means, is this project funded? Does it get funding from the CoC? And that is not what this is getting at. You would want to check yes on this for any project that is getting any federal funding for homeless projects. And that's also going to include homeless prevention projects. So for any of those, you're going to choose a yes here. You're also going to choose a yes here if even if it's a non-federally funded project, but if it primarily serves people that are experiencing homelessness. So the only reasons you would choose a no is if you have a non-federally funded project and the majority of people they are serving are not homeless. So maybe you have a project that seeks to help people find employment and the majority of those people are not homeless, then you would choose no here. But for the majority of the time, that is going to be a yes. Next, we need to select what CoCs this project covers. The easiest way to do this is go ahead and choose Georgia. So this will filter just to show Georgia CoCs. This is a multiple select box, so this is where we could select multiple CoCs. I'm going to say this one is just serving Atlanta. And then this is where we can give multiple organizations access to this project. This would normally not be the case. For the most part, most projects are just under one organization. However, if you had a project that is shared between organizations, so there's multiple organizations, for instance, that are enrolling clients into one project, this is where this would be set up. Now, because I logged in as my training organization when I first started this, it automatically has my training organization selected. And if I scroll down, I can verify that. And we'll see that listed here. But like I mentioned, this is a multiple select box, so if I wanted to, I could select another agency here. I'll go ahead and click next to go over to the next screen, and this takes us to the auto exit feature of ClientTrack. I want to spend a little time on here just explaining how auto exit works, and I also want to do just a brief warning on this. So this is not a feature you would use with a lot of projects in the system. It's going to be more of a unique feature that's going to work with just very specific scenarios. So the general idea behind auto exit is that it is going to allow any clients enrolled in this project to be automatically exited after a certain amount of days when they don't receive a service that's recorded for them in ClientTrack. And we can read about that here if you need any more clarification on that. So we're looking at how many days has it been since the client has received a service for this enrollment. And so let's say we wanted to say 50 days. A few things to note about this is you would not want to use this for residential projects at all, because a residential project, they should be exiting their clients as soon as they leave their project, because they should always be aware of a client is no longer there. So you do not want to use this with residential projects. Also, for most funded projects, they are going to require end users to do what would be called a proper exit, which is where you're actually doing an exit interview with the client. You're answering those questions on exit, such as income and barriers and those kind of things, so you can get the outcomes that are needed. So again, you probably would not want to use this for most funded projects. However, path projects are actually a really good fit for this, and most, if not all, path projects in the system are using this feature. And the reason it works so good for them is because they have a very high volume of people they might initially enroll in ClientTrack, but then never have any contact going forward. And so this allows the system to go ahead and auto exit those clients. So here we've set 50 days for how long we want it to be before they haven't received a service before it's going to auto exit them. Next, we're going to set the auto exit reason. This would normally be selected as unknown disappeared, because that's kind of what we're saying is this client disappeared. We don't know where they went to, and so we want the system to take care of them and exit them. Also, just so you know, on the destination question, so when you exit a client normally through the exit workflow, the first two questions it's going to ask are about the reason why are they being exited, and it's also going to ask the destination. For any clients that are auto exited, the destination is going to be no exit interview completed. That's what you would see if you went and looked at that exit information. So that's just something to note. And of course, because no exit interview is being completed, it's not going to have any of the exit information to go along with the exit, such as those individual exit assessments, the income, the barriers, and that kind of thing. And so that's just something to note when you are running data quality reports, for instance, that will show as missing data. And we have some users get confused on that, because at first they hear about the auto exit feature and they're like, hey, this is great, this will save us a lot of time, we won't have to exit people to do it for us. But then they realize, oh well, of course it's not going to be adding all of the exit assessment questions, and we're supposed to be doing that, and they run into a big data quality problem. So that is just something to always be aware of with this feature. Here we have alert on auto exit. I would normally recommend unchecking this. If this is checked, what it's going to do is for every client that it is auto exited, there is going to be a notification put on the client record. So every client, when you pull a client up, there's a little bell icon like this. And there's going to be a little bubble there with a notification. And when you put your mouse over it, it will say, this client has not received services in so long. And it's also going to put a notification on the case manager's notification area as well. So it's going to potentially generate a good bit of notifications that for our purposes and our implementation aren't always necessary. So again, I would recommend keeping that unchecked for our use. However, this next option here, you would always want to check this. So this is an important one. This is use direct enrollment reference for participation. So by default, if this is not checked, what services are going to be counting? So what services that this is going to be looking for before it auto exits someone is participation services. And that is actually a feature we disabled in the system because for our implementation, because we use shared service codes, it would not work correctly. And so what we want to do is check this box, and what this does is this just looks for services that are tied to the enrollment. And as you know, in our implementation, the way we've got it set up is when you go record a service, you can't just record a service without tying it to the enrollment. You always have to select enrollment first, and then you're able to go ahead and record those individual services. And so this just means that it is going to just be looking at services tied to this enrollment, and if they don't get any services tied to this enrollment in 50 days, it will auto exit them. And that covers that feature. Next, we have the auto alert days. So this is a little less severe than this option. Instead of exiting the client, it would just set up those alerts in the system that the client has not received service in so many days. So if I typed in 50 here, I would want to make sure use direct enrollment reference for participation is checked. And now what would happen is any client that does not get any services in 50 days for this enrollment, then they're going to get notifications on the case manager area and then also on the client record. Here we have program capacity. So let's say I only had 50 beds in this emergency shelter and they're all individual beds, so I can only hold 50 people at a time. If I wanted to, I could set this capacity here. If I set this here and I don't check this box, what's going to happen is if I tried to enroll more than 50 people, when I get to that 51st person, I'm going to get a warning on the program enrollment screen that I am going over my limit. This can be helpful if users need a reminder that, hey, maybe there is an end user, maybe there is a client that I forgot to exit. They've already left, so yes, we do have a free bed, but I just forgot to exit them, and now it's looking like there is more than 50 people in the project. So it can help with some data quality issues. If you click limit enrollments, this is actually going to force this restriction where it won't even allow you to enroll more than 50 people. So if you get to the program enrollment screen and there's already 50 people enrolled, it will not let you enroll, and you'll get an error message that your limit has been reached. I would just say be careful with this because there are certain scenarios where maybe temporarily you will have more than your standard allotment enrolled at one time. One example would be, say you have say in this emergency shelter, the person that does all of the exits, maybe they just work Monday through Friday, but you're a 7 days a week shelter. So say on Friday you're at capacity, there's 50 people. Someone leaves from your emergency shelter on Saturday, so you have an empty bed. However, that person that does those exits, they're not there. They're not going to do that till Monday. Well, then if someone else came in on Saturday and there was someone to go in and try to record that enrollment, well, of course, the system would not let them because it's already going to see that there are 50 people in there. One thing you can do to kind of provide a buffer there is you could say, for instance, it's 52. It gives a little bit of breathing room for those situations. But again, that's just something to be aware of when using the program capacity feature. So now I'll go ahead and click Finish. And this is going to go ahead and create our project. What I like to always do then is just search for our project to make sure it exists in the system. So I'm going to search for part of the name here, and we can see it is listed here. If I needed to make an edit to that project, I can click the action button beside it, click on edit, and it's going to bring up the same options that we just looked at. I can go in and make any changes and then click finish to save those changes. Auto posting service is a very unique feature of project setup that you would only use under very certain scenarios. And so the idea behind this is if there is a particular service that we can say every client that's going to be enrolled in this project is going to get guaranteed on a regular basis, we can set the system up where it will automatically record that service under a certain frequency. So for instance, let's say for this emergency shelter, we give a meal to every single person that's going to be enrolled here at our emergency shelter. Here we can set the units of measure. So if we wanted to look at this through dollars or minutes or hours or count, we're just going to say we want to look at the count. It's just going to be 1, so that'll be one meal. We're not going to look at the value there. Then we would click auto post. Let's do a frequency of 1 and mark it as daily. So what this would do is it would give this meal service with this unit of measure one time every day. So any clients that are in this project and have an active enrollment in this project, a service is going to be recorded of a meal. Here we have an option of prorating if we needed to set that. Here we can set a auto posting start date. So if this was a feature that just needed to start after a certain date, you could set that date right here. But again, this is a feature that you won't use on a regular basis because for most projects and most services, it's not something that everyone's just going to get guaranteed. And so you have to make sure that's the case before you would set something like this up. So for instance, in this case, let's say actually we just give meals Monday through Friday. We don't give meals on the weekend. Well, already we would then be recording 2 extra meals every week for every client based on this, right? Because we're saying they are getting this daily. And let's also say, what if we are giving a meal 7 days a week to every client in this shelter? What if a client can refuse a meal, and so there might be a day they don't get a meal? Well, then we're recording extra meals now if we have this feature enabled. So just think through the practical use cases for this. Also, you would never want to use this for a bed night count service. So if an agency ever requests that they want you to set this up just to record their bed nights, you would not want to do that. And one reason why is if a client is enrolled in a project and let's say they leave my shelter tonight, they walk out, they're gone, but I don't go and actually update, I don't go exit them out of the system until a couple days from now. So that's when I get around to going in and doing the exit, but I am going to backdate the exit to reflect today. Because I've waited a couple days, for the next 2 days, it's going to go ahead and record a service for them in the system. And then when I go do an exit and even backdate it, it's not going to go delete those extra 2 services that are recorded over the next 2 days. So that's another thing to kind of think through in just the way this feature works. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of that now. Another option that you have on here is program sites and facilities. This is a feature that we are currently not using because this goes along with the emergency shelters that are set up night by night, which we do not do. So you can disregard this option. However, these next 2 options are relevant and important. These come into play on the HIC data that you will need to be able to access. And so what this will do is record your CoC code for this project and your geocode. So whatever your geocode is for this project, you can key that in here, and then we have our address and zip code, city, state, zip code. I can go ahead and save that. So now we're going to have our information saved for this project. And then we also have bed and unit inventory information. So for any bed projects, this is definitely going to be relevant for the HIC. This would show any bed inventory you've already set up in here. So we're going to click add new inventory. We're going to have a information date. This is just the date that you are verifying this is accurate for. This you can disregard because this defaults from housing, which isn't anything that we have set up in our implementation. This is going to list the CoCs that the project covers, so you'll just select that there. The time period for these beds, so this might be something that has been going on. We've had these number of beds for a long time, so we would put that date when these beds became available. If there is an end date for these beds, we can set that here. This would become especially relevant for seasonal beds, for instance. So if there's certain beds you're just doing on a seasonal basis, you can set that here. Here we'll put our household type. So we're going to say this emergency shelter is just households without children, 50 beds, unit inventory. Also, if you ever need any help with this, looking at HUD documentation will help you fill this out accurately. Our bed type, we're going to say these are just year-round beds. This would allow you to list your veteran bed inventory, youth bed inventory, how many of these beds are being captured in HMIS. So we're going to say they are doing 50 because we just set this project up in HMIS, and hopefully they would be using this for anyone that is using any of those beds. Now we'd be able to go ahead and click save. And now we're going to have this inventory in here. So if there's different household types that you serve, you're going to have to go in and add new inventory for each one, so you can kind of track the different categories. Same way, if there were some seasonal beds I managed or had in my project, I would go ahead and do new inventory, add those seasonal beds and so forth until you have all of your beds represented here. You probably would not want to go in and delete these ever. What you would do instead is, if your inventory is changing or going away, you can go add that end date and then add a new listing of what the bed count is like now. So that's going to cover setting up your bed inventory. And then finally, we do have a delete button, although you would rarely ever go in and actually delete a project. If a project has been in the system and has ever had any enrollments recorded for it, we would advise against deleting. Instead, what you would want to do is go in and edit the project and just set an end date on it. And you could also go in and say clients can't enroll in it, so that way the end user is not going to see this project listed anymore. But again, for historic reasons, you would not want to go in and delete it. Unless it was a project you just accidentally created and no one ever used, you could go in and delete it in that case. And if that was what had happened and you deleted it, like most things in Client Track, it is a soft delete. You can go in to the recycle bin and view deleted projects like so. So what we've done now is we've created a project in Client Track. But if this is all we did, and we don't continue on setting up a grant and linking the grant, then a end user would still not be able to enroll a client into this project. This project would still not show up on a program enrollment screen. So now we'll look at setting up a grant. To create a grant, you'll want to go ahead and navigate back under your Georgia CoC admin menu, hover over Setup Data Management, and click on Grants. And just like the project search screen, this is going to list all of the grants that are in the system. We can search for those grants here. This search works a little different than the project search. If I just typed in HOPE, for instance, and we can see there's a listing here that has HOPE in the title, it's not going to pull up anything because it is just searching for grants that begin with HOPE. So if you don't know the exact name of the grant, though, you can always use the %sign as a wildcard, and now it's just going to search for anything with hope in the title. Same way it works with org. So if I want to search for a grant by its owning organization or primary organization, I can do that here, and it will list all of those. By default, it's only going to show HMIS grants. What that means is it's just looking at grants that have an official federal grant program selected. Normally this is going to always be the case. However, if you have created a grant that does not have this, or if it is either a NA, that's the federal grant program you chose, or private or other non-federal, then you'll need to uncheck that to be able to see it. Here you can actually search by federal grant program. So if I wanted to look at all my ESG grants in the system, I could do that, and it will have them all listed here. Here it's only going to show active grants. So again, we're basing that on the end date. If this end date has already passed, then it would not be listed here if this is checked. Over here we have the Add New button if we need to create a new grant. We'll look at these columns here. We have the Action button, which we'll get into a little bit later. Of course, the grant name. Just like a project, every grant will have an owning or primary org. It'll be listed here. For any grants that were brought in from migration, those will have a source ID, and we'll see that listed here. And then you'll see the federal grant program and the grant program component for each grant, and a begin date and an end date. So for this training, we're going to say we do need to go ahead and create a new grant because we just created a new project, and so we need to create a grant to go along with that. So we'll do that by clicking Add New. The first thing we'll need to do here is create our grant ID. So any grant created in the system needs to have a unique 3-character grant ID. This can be any combination of 3 letters and or numbers. I usually will try to do an acronym of the project that this grant is going to go alongside, but for this training I'll just do ABC here. If you by chance create a grant ID or attempt to create a grant ID that has already been created in the system, when you go to click Save, you'll just get an error on the screen that lets you know you need to select a different grant ID. Next we have grant description. So just like project description, this is something you want to be particular with and not just name it something generic. You want to name this something that makes sense to be linked to the project you're creating it for. Also, we know that end users, anytime they are recording services, they have to select a grant, because grants is what we have set up in the system to filter the particular services that an end user will have access to. So we want to name this something that an end user could pick out from their drop-down list and be able to select an appropriate service to go along with it. So I'm going to just attempt to name this the same as the project I created that this is going to be linked to. And we know we started with the organization name, and then we started with the project name. And you might run into this here. So the grant description is limited by 30 characters. So it's a little shorter than the project character limit. So one way around that, a common practice, is to just acronym the organization name. And I still want to go ahead and include the shelter name here, or the project name here, because this is again going to allow a end user to quickly identify this grant when they are recording services. And then it's a good idea to include the funding source for this grant. So we know the project type we chose previous is a emergency shelter. So let's say this project is funded by a ESG emergency shelter grant. So I'm going to do ESG, and then I'm going to do ES for emergency shelter. And now we can kind of have a good idea of what this grant is here. And this is going to keep the system organized, and it's going to help you as an admin as well when you are going in and linking grants to projects. Here we have grantee agency. This is not a required field, as you can see by the lack of asterisk here. So we can continue on. Because I'm logged in under my training organization, it's automatically going to have this listed here. And like we said on projects, every grant will have one owning or primary organization. This is not required, but if it's beneficial, you can record address information relevant to this grant. And then finally we get to what I would call the meat and potatoes of grant setup. And this is really where we are setting what this grant is. What's the funding source this grant represents? So a few things to think about in relation to grants is grants drive the data collection in workflows. So anytime an end user is in a workflow, whether they are enrolling a client or performing an annual assessment, a during program enrollment assessment, maybe they're exiting a client, all of the assessments that come up in those workflows while they are doing that are driven by what grant you select here. So it's really important for you to select the correct grant here. And I can't stress that enough. Also, because this is what drives the logic in the system and workflows, you should create and link grants that are relevant to the data and services you need to record. So for instance, if you get a request from an agency where they have a project that is funded by ESG Emergency Shelter Grant, but they also have a United Way grant, and they also have some other non-federal grants that help fund this project, well, there's no need to go in and try to set up grants to represent each of those non-federal grants, because really what we're trying to get at here is we want to make sure the system is capturing the required information for this grant. And this is going to include all of these federally funded grant programs. So again, just something to think through in setting up the way you set up grants and projects. Also, we have seen a lot of issues in regards to grant setup in the system. So for instance, if we set this up as RAI, we know that now when a user would do an intake on a client in the system that's connected to this grant, they would, of course, have RAI assessment questions that automatically come up in the workflow. And the opposite is true as well. If this should be a RAI grant that's tied to the project, but I don't select it as a RAI grant, then those assessments are not going to come up in the workflow. And this is what we have dealt with a lot, and so you end up with a lot of missing data because the end user, they might not be aware of the requirements of their project, and so they are just doing intakes. They are going all the way through the workflow thinking they're capturing everything they need to when they're not, and it's all because the grant setup is incorrect. So again, you want to make sure, to the best of your ability at least, that this is set up properly. We've seen from time to time where sometimes an agency might think a grant needs to be set up a certain way and they are incorrect. And so as a CoC admin, you really want to be educated on proper grant setup and how that corresponds to the project type. A tool you have at your disposal is the HMIS project setup tool. This is a tool that you can get from HUD for free. And what it allows you to do is you can select the grant program and component up top here. So let's say, for instance, in our training example we're setting up, we have an ESG emergency shelter. So I'm going to go ahead and select that as the funding source. And now it's going to tell us the project type, which is emergency shelter. And this one's a pretty easy one, right? We said it's funded by ESG Emergency Shelter Grant, so the project type is going to be emergency shelter. Some of the other ones that can be a little more confusing, and that's where this tool can really help out. For instance, if I had a Hopwa housing information grant well, the project type is going to be services only. This tool also has links to your HMS data dictionary and data standards manual, something I mentioned previously in this video that can be a great resource to you guys in setting up projects and grants. And it also has links here to the federal partner program manuals, which can be helpful as well. So again, we just want to spend a little time and make sure this is set up correctly. Another thing to note here, you'll see a private or other non-federal grant option here. You would only use this under very specific instances. If you set up a grant like this, they are not going to be able to enroll a client into a project funded by this unless the agency and end user have access to the non-federal partner projects work group. This work group was set up for a limited number of agencies that were given permission to use this in order to record very streamlined intakes that don't require things like income, insurance sources, things like that the majority of projects capture. And of course those are for all non-federally funded projects or it's only for non-federally funded projects in the system. The majority of everyone is not going to be in that work group, so this would normally not be an option you would use under the grant setup. However, one other reason you might set up a grant under this is if you were setting up a grant just to be able to connect services to, so you're not actually going to associate this grant with a project, then you can do that and use this option, and you could go ahead and then under services setup connect the non-funded services to this. Because as mentioned previous, we know when we are recording services that you have to select a grant always. So for this training, we said that this is an emergency shelter funded by ESG, so we have that selected there and we can continue on in our process. Next we have grant identifier. If you are a RI project, this is required, so you want to always put this in here. This is going to affect your RI exports. Every grant will have a begin date that's required. This normally would go along with your project start date. If your grant date is different though, you can key that in here. An end date is required as well. So if you have a specific end date that you know of for your grant, you can select that. Or if you don't have a end date, you can, what we normally do is just go and set a future date. That way we don't have to worry about this grant stopping working anytime soon. Next we have accessing organizations. By default, it's automatically going to have my training organization selected because I am logged in as them, but it would allow me to select other organizations here if I needed to. This option is just for historic reasons, so for our implementation, you should always leave that unchecked. And then just like on the project setup screen, define eligibility is not anything we are currently using, and it would require a system admin to even set this up properly, as a CoC admin would not have the permissions set up in the system, so this is something you can disregard. So now that we have set that, I can go ahead and click Save. And this is what I was talking about, where if you choose a grant ID that's already been chosen, it will just give you a error message right here, and then I can go ahead and select a different one. And there we go, and it has created the grant. What I like to do here is just go ahead and search for that grant. Remember, we'll need to use the wildcard if we just want to search for part of the grant name. So I'm going to do that, and I can see here's my grant, and I can check these to make sure everything looks good and check the dates here. So at this point we've created the project, we've then created the grant, but at no point have we told the system that this particular grant is linked to the project that we created previously. And so right now, An end user, if they went and tried to enroll someone into the project we created, they still would not be able to do that because we have to complete the third step, which gets overlooked a lot, and that is linking this grant to the project. So we'll go ahead and now start that process. There's one of two ways we can accomplish that. We can either start with the program access method, where we are going to go search for the project that we created and then tell it what grant that it's linked with. Or we can go to grant access, where we would search for the grant that we created and then tell it what project it will fund. Either way, it's actually going to have the exact same end result. So for this training, I'll just go to program access. But because I'm logged in as my training organization, it automatically has this pulled up, and this is what sets or lets you know what projects are active under this organization. So if I wanted to go ahead and bring any projects active under my training organization, I could go ahead and sort this. It'll bring this to the top, which will let me choose the project that I just created. I could also, if there's a really big list like this, it might be easier to just go ahead and search by project name. Again, I'll need to use the wildcard if I want to just be able to search for part of the project name. So I'm just going to type in that, and sure enough, there is my project that I created. If I hover over this is where I'm going to be able to select the grant to go along with this project. So I'm going to click on this. It's now going to give me a list of all of the different grants that are under this organization. So this is where, like I mentioned, it's really beneficial to name your grant something you can easily identify. So we can see here, this is that grant that I created. So I'm going to go ahead and click here, and this is what actually links this grant to that project. This is also going to have a start date as well. Normally this is going to mirror that same begin date for your project start date and your grant start date, but this is just saying when did this grant begin to fund this project. So if that is going to be different than that start date, you can go ahead and set that there. The end date is not required, so you can leave that blank, and you can leave budget amount blank. Now I'll go ahead and click Save and Close. And I guess another thing to mention here would be, as you can see, if I needed to set up multiple grants to fund one project, I could do that. So this is how I would select more than one grant. But for this, we're just going to say this one ESG emergency shelter grant is what's funding our project. Now I'll go ahead and click Save and Close. And those are linked together. Something I always recommend after completing all these steps is going ahead and testing them out before you tell an end user that they're good to go. Again, because we saw there's so many little things where if you miss one step, it's not going to show that program as something that a user can enroll a client into. So what I do here is just go through the beginnings of a project intake. I would just use a pre-existing client in the system because I'm not actually going to enroll them into the project, so I'm not making any changes in the system. And that way, I just want to see if that project shows as an option. And that's going to let me know that I completed all of the steps for this creation. And so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down here, and sure enough, we can see my training organization, John Shelter. So that lets me know that I have created a project. I was sure to include a project type under that project. I created a grant, and then I went in and linked the two together. So when you've done all that, then it's going to populate, and only then is it going to populate as an option here. That covers our training for project and grant setup and linking the two together. Thanks.